So, Jennifer, tell everybody, let's start with where did you grow up? Where did it all start for you?
Where did it all start? So I actually grew up in Bedford, New Hampshire, which is a little suburb outside of Manchester, New Hampshire. Manchester's New Hampshire's largest city, which that's
Nice.
not saying that much because
Yeah.
it is New Hampshire. But it's a nice small city. So I grew up in a suburb of that, and I went to school in Manchester.
Were your parents artistic at all? What did they do for a living?
Oh gosh, not artistic at all, at all. My father was a mechanic by trade, and my mom did a little bit of everything. But then when I was about 10, she went to school for nursing and she
Uh,
became a nurse for Alzheimer's care. So,
nice.
but I mean, I would never call them artistic. They didn't even do like crafts. They gardened and they did a lot with like flowers and plants. So
Well, there's some of
there's
that.
that. Yeah.
I think everybody needs a little creative outlet, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So, what would you say then are some of your earlier influences that made you want to be an artist?
I'm not sure. I feel like not being good at math and science was an influence. I also started dancing at a very, very young age, and I liked the idea of performing and I loved creativity. I learned to read very young, so I was constantly reading. I think I just fell in love with words so much that I wanted to do something with them.
But dancing is where it all started for you then.
Yes, yeah, I was 3 when I first started dancing, and yeah, so I was 3 the first time I was ever on stage. So,
Did you have any nervousness going into that, or do you remember even having nervousness, or did you
um,
feel like that was like your home?
I don't remember having any nervousness at all, which is strange because as a kid I was actually really, really shy. Like if
Mm,
I was called on in class, I was nervous. If I had to give a
interesting.
book report, I was petrified. But if I was performing, I wasn't. Like if I got to be somebody else, I think that was easier for me than being like dorky, nerdy Jennifer Gordon.
You've had a lot of formal training too. So what about the formal training do you feel like has helped you as an artist?
So I have had a lot of formal training in dance and in theater, especially. And I think, and I still take writing classes and stuff now. I've just kind of started that. I think it helps any artist to like have just like more tools in their tool belt. And it gives you the confidence to kind of like reach into that tool belt and always know that you're going to be able to pull out the right tool for the job. So whether that is like acting technique or dance technique or even just like different prompts and different ways of looking at things for writing, I think training and classes and learning and always growing and always exploring, I think is really important for an artist of any
Hmm.
kind. If you just kind of say like, oh, I've got it, I've learned everything I need to learn, I'm not going to do anything anymore, you just get stagnant, and I don't think you grow after that.
What do you feel like the early performances? What do you think that they've given you? What do you remember fondly about them?
I think the earliest performances were obviously dance, and I don't remember much besides like really it seems like a blur. I remember the costumes. I remember I loved the fact that I got flowers after I performed for dance, like like your
Yeah,
parents would
yeah.
bring you flowers. But then, I didn't start taking performance really seriously until I dabbled in high school, but it wasn't until I went to the New Hampshire Institute of Art and started studying theater and acting that I really started taking it seriously at that point in time. So, and I think, again, just being in the classroom and being surrounded by other performers and other artists helps you grow. It helps you like explore like things about yourself memory wise that you just never would have explored without them. So I think my earliest performances that have inspired me were actually in the classroom.
Do you feel like there was one in particular that really challenged you that you kind of gravitated toward?
Yeah, I think, I mean, and so the favorite role that I've ever had in my entire life was Mayella in To Kill a Mockingbird,
Oh, nice.
because I thought she was, such a tragic character and such a
Yeah.
hard character to play. I had to say words that I don't say in real life, and I don't like I had to say the N word on stage multiple times every day because we did school matinees and like twice on the weekends, and it was being able to like access part of me that I didn't think existed was a great learning experience. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was just like
Sure.
she was such as a character, she's so broken that and she, accuses somebody of rape that didn't rape her, but really she's getting, abused by her father. There's so much there. And to be able to like go to that really dark place every day and be on a stage with people who were supportive. It was one of those like dream shows where everybody in the cast was absolutely amazing. So when I always think back on that as like my favorite time.
Knowing what you write and how you write it, it makes a lot of sense. A little bit, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like my entire life has just been like trying to access like dark, twisted parts of my soul and like bearing them to the world.
I mean, acting is kind of, I love talking about this with theater folks, especially ones who I know have done multiple performances, especially within the same day. It's an interesting dynamic for me, as somebody who's dabbled in theater, and I did it badly, but dabbling in it a little bit. I never really got to this point, but the interesting thing for me is like when you take on a performance, you seem to want to change it up. When you're doing, especially if you're doing multiple performances, there's a challenge that actors take on that they like. They either change the way they speak in dialect, or they get louder, or they get more pronounced. They try different things.
Yeah.
Did you enjoy that experimental part of that aspect of theater? Did you take that on? Did you feel
I
like that was
did.
something that was cool about it?
Yeah, that actually, like when you were talking about that, that gave me chills. So I love that. Yeah, I mean, there's like such beauty in live theater and such beauty in any kind of, just like us talking right now, like I see
Mhm.
you and I can respond to you.
Yeah.
And I feel like when, we're talking and we're having this great conversation, if it was like in a petri dish, if I was on stage by myself, it's different. But nobody can be the same person, the same performance every single day
Mhm.
for weeks and weeks, months and months. So all it takes is one actor on that stage to make a slightly different choice, and like you feel the energy on this stage completely change.
Mhm.
And and a good cast can play off of each other like that.
Right, right.
And then it's not somebody who's just trying to be like, oh, I'm just going to try to do something to mess people up. It's not that at all. It's just kind of like accessing where you are emotionally that day. Like I remember one very specific performance when I was doing Mayella, that it was in the courtroom scene, and I had to say that N word that I don't say, raped me. And I
Mhm.
just remember like I'd been doing the role for weeks, and the emotions of that were like so built up inside me. And when I said those words, like I was like scrunching the bottom of my costume, scrunching the bottom of my dress, and I actually like tore it. I tore the
Oh.
fabric when I said those words. And I just remember looking at the actor who was playing Atticus Finch, and like the look on his face when I like tore part of my dress, like everything changed. Like it was just the look on his face was amazing. The man who was playing our Tom Robinson started weeping,
Wow.
and I was just like, and it was incredible, and it was just like a little thing that I didn't know I was going to do. It just happened, and that was like the performance of my life.
So going from dance to acting, you transition into fiction. When did you decide that you were going to write fiction?
Well, I always wanted to write fiction. I mean,
Hmm.
but I feel like as you get older, you start telling yourself that you can't do things like,
Yeah.
oh, I can't write a book. I don't have any, like, I don't have any training. I don't even know how to write a book. How would I
Right.
do this? And you lose confidence in yourself and in the world, really. And you keep saying you can't do something, you can't do it. Or in my case, I was saying I can't do it, but someday I'll be able to. Someday I'll be, and I don't know what I was waiting for. Like someday I'll take a class or I'll take a series of classes or I'll go back to school and it'll teach me how to write a novel.
Mm.
And that never happened. I feel like I got to a point in my life where I couldn't stop myself anymore. Like I had a story that was like building inside me that I really needed to get out. And one day I just sat down at the computer and I thought, maybe I'll write a short story. I don't know what this is.
Mm.
Like like I knew what I wanted to write vaguely. And I sat down at the computer and that's how I wrote my first novel. Like it came out, it only took like 3 months, I think, for the first draft or second or third draft. I don't even know. But I wrote it very quickly and it was just, it felt so right. And I felt like I was seeing a friend that I hadn't seen in years. And it just felt so good.
Did any of your artistic disciplines, dancing and acting, did you draw upon any of that when you're writing, or is that something that you had to kind of incorporate gradually?
No, I definitely explore the acting
Hmm.
side of me, I would say much more because I develop characters the same way when I'm writing as I did when I was on the stage. Like they
Nice.
have a backstory. I answer in my head all of the crucial questions about them. Like I know every single thing about them, or they tell me things. And that sounds weird, but my characters tell me things that I didn't know about them, and I discover it, and that's kind of that discovery on stage.
Mm.
So I think acting and writing they're symbiotic to me.
Even like the storytelling aspect, do you find that you kind of, because I mean you've seen screenplays, you've seen stage plays, you've probably even written some. Do you feel like, because that is such a disciplined 3 act structure kind of idea, do you feel like you get a tone or a pace from your acting skills to kind of add to the
Um,
storytelling element?
I think when writing dialogue, especially, that can happen. I think from being on stage so much and taking so many acting classes, like you just observe people because
Mm.
as an actor you have to observe people, and so I think it's easier for me to write dialogue probably than almost anything else because I know how people talk and I know how they move, and especially because they're characters that I've developed and I've made. I just kind of picture it as a movie or picture it as a play the entire time.
Do you act it out loud?
Yes.
I do the same.
Yeah, yeah. I'm all of the voices.
Uh,
I'm everything. You know, my husband can hear me doing like a bad Northern Irish accent coming from the bedroom. Um, I usually don't do it during I call it my vomit draft, my
uh,
first draft. I don't because it's too
yeah,
bad. I would
yeah.
like ruin it for myself. I'd be like, these characters are awful. But definitely as I'm revising, I do it out loud because I mean, you understand, like you have to like hear it and
Yeah,
like, especially dialogue, because
yeah,
sometimes you write dialogue and you're like, ooh, that's good. And then you say it out loud and you think, no human would ever talk like this.
right.
Like it's sometimes it's like dry, completely dry, or it's like overwrought.
You're right.
Like, oh, please, this is like reading like fiction and it's supposed to be a conversation.
Yeah,
Like,
my problem is like I skip words a lot when I'm writing, and so when I'm reading it, and I'll insert the words sometimes. So I think you have to kind of step away from it a little bit too, right? So
yeah.
I don't act it out until like I've been away from it for a little bit, or maybe I'll even try something else before I go back to that, so that
Oh,
I can't skip any words or anything, because I know that if I was to read it after I wrote it, I would probably, the words would be in my head, but they still wouldn't be on the page, kind of
yeah,
idea.
that makes sense. It makes sense because we know what we're trying to say.
Right.
Yeah, I take a writing class every week and we read out loud. And we usually do like a very short writing burst during the class.
Mhm.
So, and especially when I like do quick free writes, I skip tons of words. But then when I read it to the class, I'm like inserting the words that I'm like, oh, that would actually, as I'm reading, I'm like, oh, that
I
makes
do
it a
that
much
too.
better sentence if I had actually written it like that. So I'm like typing again as I'm like reading it. I'm like, oh yeah, no, definitely add in, looks like a slutty doll or
Right.
whatever.
Having read out loud screenplays and stage plays before, do you read your manuscripts in the same manner? Do you feel like there's that same kind of idea, or is it if it's a different muscle in your brain for that?
I think it's a different muscle in my brain because when I read my work, or just when I read, novels in general or fiction
Uh-huh.
work, it's more visual to me, if
Mm,
that makes sense. Like
sure.
when I read a screenplay or a stage play, it's all about the actors, the emotion, what's happening at that exact moment. Whereas I think when I'm reading my work or I'm reading a novel, I see it as a world, as an entire world. I can feel the weather on my skin. I can, smell the dust in the air. When I'm reading like a screenplay or a play, I just think about the actors,
Mhm.
which is such an actor thing to say. Like,
Right.
all I care about is the actors. I don't think about the set or the lighting or anything. I just think about me.
Now, in that context, do you just think about your part, or are you reading the whole thing for everybody's part?
When I read a play,
Yeah, or a
I read the whole
screenplay.
yeah, I definitely read everybody's part because I think as an actor, and it's been a while since I've been on stage, but as an actor, one of the ways to develop your character is what every other character is saying or not saying about your character, and the
Yeah.
way they behave and the way they talk when your character's around versus when they're not around. Like I do the whole, like I would underline anytime my character's name was mentioned,
Mhm.
every adjective used to describe my character by somebody else. So yeah, I definitely think of it as everybody, all of the actors.
Do you think you're gonna return to acting at some point? Do you feel like it's something that you wanna do again?
Yeah, probably. I mean,
Yeah?
for so long, it was like off the table because I was teaching dance. And when you teach dance afternoons and evenings and on the
Yeah.
weekends. And when you're a theater performer, you perform and rehearse in the evenings and on the weekends. So there was absolutely no way for me to do both. But now that I'm not teaching dance full time, I mean, yeah, never say never.
Mhm.
I know I would
No.
like to be back on stage. And even when I was teaching dance, I was the creative director for a cabaret troupe. So I was still performing, but it was more like dance and
Yeah.
burlesque and skits. And
And people probably wouldn't understand that how disciplined and how precise that all has to be, right? That is just
yeah,
one of those things that just has to be almost perfect every time.
yes, it
Yeah.
does.
So the stage is where you would be called to, you think? You don't think you would ever try film or anything like that?
No, wouldn't do film.
Yeah.
I'm like, again, I'm like weirdly too self-conscious. Like even when like it goes to just me, I'm like,
Yeah.
I love live theater. I love the unexpectedness of it
Hmm.
so much. I think for me, I mean, if I got offered a film role and I got to act with like Adam Driver, of course I would say yes because he is my movie husband. But I would rather be in a play with Adam Driver.
He would rather be in a play too.
I think he
That's
would.
his thing. Yeah, that's it.
I
He
know.
he loves the stage. Yeah.
Yes.
He's a fellow Marine, so
Yes, and a Juilliard grad, and
yeah.
my father was a Marine. And he's like one of those like true artists
Mm-hmm.
as well. And he gives back, like he has this theater company that he brings like theater shows to our troops, like to the
Mm-hmm.
vets,
Yeah.
and they're things written by vets about vets, and it's
Mm-hmm.
just it's incredible.
What do you like about writing books that none of the other art forms give you?
I get to be alone. I've been exceedingly social for so many years because
Yeah.
being a dancer, being a performer, it's nice to be able to kind of like go within myself, like cocoon up and just be there. And especially during the pandemic, now I'm like very used to just be like, oh, this is what I do. I'm like a house cat.
Do you find you can get into that space pretty easily, though, or does it take you some time?
It takes me some time. I I can get into it quickly, strangely enough, if I'm in a class or something and I get like a good writing prompt
Mm-hmm.
and the instructor says you have 17 minutes, go. I can do it. I can get
Mm-hmm.
there and I can write the words. Like I write words and they make sense. But sometimes like when I'm sitting down to like work on my novel, I feel like there's like this 45-minute window of me just
Mm-hmm.
like screwing around online, getting into the zone, opening my document like 90 times, getting distracted by something I have to research, then going on Expedia and looking at vacations. And I'm like, oh, whoa, what am I doing? I'm supposed to be writing. Um, so, I mean, it takes me a little while. And
Once you're in it, though, are you go pretty full bore?
I do. I
Yeah.
do. I mean, but it's like, but just getting there. And
Yeah. Yeah.
some days I don't get there. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's happens to you where it's like
Oh
you
yeah,
go in
all the time.
your room and you're like, I'm gonna write. I'm going to
Yeah.
do it. And
Yeah.
then some days there's no words. Like
Yeah.
they're not
And
there.
and you could probably relate to this too. It's all about time too. You when you finally sit down a time to do it, right? And it's not there, it's like you feel like you're wasting the time. You could be doing
Yeah,
other things.
exactly.
You got so much to do, and I'm always complaining about not having enough time. And
Yeah,
yet when I set aside time, it's never worked. It's always the most inconvenient time when I get an inspiration or anything like that.
exactly, exactly. I'm in the middle of doing like 90 things and I'm just like, oh,
Yeah.
I understand the villain's motivation now.
Yeah.
And then I think, well, it's okay because it's such a strong idea. It won't slip my mind. And then,
Yeah.
4 hours later, when I get a chance to sit in front of the laptop, I'm like, what was that brilliant thought I had?
So I'm curious, which of the art forms do you think we see the most of you in?
Definitely the writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely the writing. Because I feel like almost all of the characters that I write, even the terrible ones, have a little bit of me in them.
Mm.
And I do slip some of my truth in there, like things that have
Mm.
happened to me, like
Hmm.
very specifically. So I know Pretty Ugly is there's a brass bell in that book. And so when people listen to this interview and if they read the book, that brass bell is like an important, like I have that bell. It's on a shelf in my other room.
Nice.
It's the bell that my father would ring when he needed help when he was dying. Like, so I'm like,
Oh,
I put, I put kernels of things that have happened to me in every book.
are you somebody who likes to Easter egg a lot, or do you
Yes.
like, or is it more personal, like inside joke kind of Easter eggs for you?
Oh, no, I Easter egg a lot about my other books
Uh huh.
in my books because
Nice.
I'm like that I get like that egocentric where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna drop a little hint about blah 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 in this. But and I think I like doing it because I have readers that have read everything
Uh-huh.
and especially like Pretty Ugly takes place in like not really a different universe than my other books, but I have three books that all take place on my fictional haunted island, Dagger
Hmm.
Island. Pretty Ugly does not take place on that island, but it does take place in New England. And there is she makes reference, one of my characters makes a reference to this creepy island she went to once when she was a kid, and she's hated islands ever since. And so my beta readers who've read everything, when they got to that part, they were like, yes, that's a Dagger Island reference. And So I liked it. I like doing it for those reasons.
All right, so let's challenge your readers here as they watch this. Is there something that you've put in there that they've not yet caught?
Oh,
You don't have to tell them. Don't tell them what it is. But I'm just curious if that's the case.
I think the major ones they've all gotten.
Hmm.
I'm trying to think if I slipped anything else in there. I have like one metaphor I like to use, and my agent would probably like kill me for doing this, but I do slip it into every book. And it's just like a metaphor, but I love it so much, and it's just like a very short little metaphor, and I try to change it up a little, but it's there. It's in every single book.
She walks slowly to his bed, leaving a trail of wet footprints in her stead. She is a ghost ship, silently making its way across the sea of his room. She looks at his sleeping form. He is curled in on himself. When he was younger and stronger, he would sleep like a warrior. He was so proud. He would dominate everything. His bed, his dreams, even sleep itself would bow down under his perceived strength. He is so much older now. These days he sleeps like a child or a cat, both starving but petrified of the mouse. She hears the rattling of death, climbing out from the deepest parts of his lungs each time he exhales. It was the little things like these moments, she supposed, that she grew to love. They were her favorite part of all of this, her favorite part of this very long, endless day.
So let's talk about your art. Let's get into all the wonderful creepiness that you've created for us. You know, who was the first character you created, and how they shaped everything you've done since?
The first character I ever created, I'm just going to go with in my novels, because I created characters a while back when I wrote like a little indie comic, and then I wrote a lot of poetry. So I would say this actually will all link together. So my poetry, my indie comic, those are all very autobiographical. So the main character was me, because that's, how it works.
Mm-hmm.
But part of one of my poems became part of the first section of my book, Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent. because a lot of that book is written from a ghost's point of view, and
Mhm.
she speaks in kind of free verse poetry. So one of my poems ended up being kind of the inspiration for my ghost's voice. So I would say, and I'm just going to keep calling her the ghost because she doesn't say her name in that book until like 3/4 of the way through. So I don't like to say it until, because I want people to read it and not know her name until she's finally like names herself. So she, my ghost, yeah, she kind of like broke my mind a little bit. And I love her for that. She um because she's a ghost and she's been dead for, 60 years, and she's only had like revenge on her mind. She she was just such an interesting character to develop because you feel bad for her. She died a violent, terrible death, but you also, she's not super likable
Mm.
because she's changed over time. She's changed over the years. She was a victim when she was alive, but now she's been like hell bent on haunting her murderer for 60 years. And how does that change a person, even though she's dead? Like how, and the fact that she experiences time all at once. Like, so at
Mm.
any moment of her existence, she's in her head, she's still getting murdered on that beach, but she's also seeing somebody for the first time. Like, she experiences everything at once. So she has influenced, I think, every character I've written after that because she had such a tremendous scope of self history
Mm.
while she was alive and after her death. Yeah, I think she also made me a sucker for nonlinear storytelling, which,
Mm.
again, much to my agent's chagrin. Uh, she's like, write it linear, the book I'm working on right now.
That's funny.
She's just like, this one, no weird flashbacks. Like, okay.
So, as speaking of history, as a New Englander, you use a lot of that in your books, and you do it throughout different periods of time in history too, and sometimes even going into the future a little bit too, a
Yeah.
little dystopia. Uh, what is you're so familiar with the area. Obviously, familiarity breeds an opportunity to write about it, and it makes it easier to write. But is there something in that you had to research deeply from the area that you didn't know going
Um,
into the
well,
storytelling?
when I wrote the Hotel series, which is From Daylight to Madness and When the
Hmm.
Sleeping Dead Still Talk, those are historical, so they take place in 1873.
Hmm.
And I I had to research because again, it takes place on an island, and it's sort of based on a real island, sort of not. So I did a lot of historical research on what life was like on that island, what the winters were like just how it felt, like what the air felt like, that like just what kind of creatures were in the tidal pools, things like that.
Hmm.
And I employed a genealogist, wonderful woman named Nadine Ferraro. Hi, Nadine. Uh, she did some great historical research for me about the Portland, Maine area because I had
Hmm.
wanted one of my characters, Isabel, to grow up in a poorhouse. And I didn't, like, I knew in theory what that was like, but she gave me like real facts. Like,
Hmm.
these were the names of the people who lived in a specific poorhouse in Portland, Maine, in the year that you want your character to be there.
Hmm.
And I was just like, oh, it was just so cool. And to just like kind of like, even though I didn't really use a lot of that in the book, but I just
Hmm.
like I needed it in my head
Hmm.
so I could put her there and I could see her there and I could shape her.
Hmm. I imagine writing a book from a New Englander's perspective is a challenge because there, New England area, Northeast area is very famous for its cadence, its dialect,
Yeah.
its use of words, the way that they talk, and the thickness of their accents and things like that, and conveying that in a manuscript setting in a non-visual way. Is that been a challenge for you? Do you gravitate toward that? Is that something you use when you're
Um,
writing?
yes and no. So I'm from New Hampshire. So we don't have that thick of a New England accent. We're not
Hmm.
like Boston and we're not like Maine.
Mhm.
But so what I try to do instead of like writing the accent, because sometimes that can end up looking like comedy, I
Yeah.
try to think of like the New England sensibility. People here are sometimes quiet and sometimes stoic, and there's a rhythm to the language. There's a rhythm to like those old timers who live in Maine and they've lived in Maine their whole life. Where, so it was like the rhythm of the speech I wanted,
Mm.
and a lot of people like my parents, my mom is French, so Canadian French. And so she grew up speaking French and she didn't learn English until later in life. And a lot of people growing up that I grew up with, they all had French parents. So all the parents had like a strange way of talking. And it was above and beyond the Canadian accent. Like they would put the words in the wrong order. So they would say like, throw me down the stairs, my shoes, instead of throw my shoes down the stairs. So like, so sometimes I'll use that kind of like weird phrasing and people are like, this is wrong. And I'm like, I know, but it's like, it's supposed to be wrong. So I actually have like my character in Pretty Ugly talk about the fact that her father would always say phrases like that.
Your poor editors.
I know. They're like, this is wrong. And I'm like, okay, I mean, I can fix it, but I did, just so you know, I did do it on purpose.
Where does the story find its footing for you? When do you feel like you've really accomplished, moving forward with a
Um,
story?
it's always in the characters for me. Like if they get inside my heart and in my head, then I just have to like see their story through to the end. And I
Nice.
think like, and whatever, because I'm kind of a pantser, sometimes I don't know what that's going to be. I'm just like, I don't know what's going to happen here. Uh, I usually know the very beginning. I know like the climax sometimes,
Hmm.
and I know the end, or I
Hmm.
have like a vague idea of at the end. For the first time, I'm writing a book that I don't know the end to,
Oh, interesting.
and like the other day, I was like, oh, I think I might know it, and I said the ending to my husband because he's like the only person I'm talking to this about this one book with, and he said, that doesn't even make sense. What does that even mean? And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what it means, but it was just like a really great last line. And
Mm.
he was like, yeah, I guess, but like, is it going to make any sense? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't
So,
know.
like all pantsers, the middle is usually your soft spot, right? That's where you have the hardest time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm at like, in my work in progress, I'm smack dab at 60,000 words
Oh
going,
yeah.
how do I get the stuff to happen? I'm
Right.
like, there's a bunch of stuff that I know has to happen. And I just can't quite like get there yet.
Connecting the
I
dots. Yeah.
know. I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm like, she has to go from being here to, oh my gosh, everything's crazy. I
you
don't know how
you
to do it.
you mentioned that you like to get in the character's head. So what appeals to you about presenting like a psychological, character perspective?
Oh gosh. Honestly, I'm gonna say I think because like it's gonna come out terrible, but most of my family's crazy. Like really crazy. Um, mental illness runs pretty rampantly
Mm,
and on my mom's side of the family.
mm,
So growing up, I always had this like absolute fear that I was going to develop schizophrenia. Like
mm.
because like several of my aunts have it, my cousin has it. And I just kept thinking, I could be normal one day and then develop schizophrenia. So I had this like paranoia up until like the age of like I want to say 24. Usually like a schizophrenic will have like their first major episode before age 24, and I just kept
Mm.
thinking like I just have to get to 24. Like if I get to 24, fine, I'll probably end up with like regular depression, anxiety disorder, which I do. I have those things, but like I'll bypass schizophrenia.
Mm.
And I did. Um, so I think for me, because I had that like weird obsession, I read a lot of abnormal psychology books. and
Oh,
like
interesting.
case studies and things like that. That's what I read for fun
Hmm.
in
Like
high
Carl
school.
Jung and stuff like that.
Yeah, like Carl Jung, and I was like obsessed with multiple personality disorder. I'm DID now, so I read Sybil
Mm-hmm.
countless times. I read When Rabbit Howls, Three Faces of Eve. I read
Mm-hmm.
any book I could get on like schizophrenia, and I was for a while in college. I was like, I'm going to major in psychology, and then I realized I'd have to take a math class. I'd have to take statistics, and then I was like, nope, can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never be a doctor.
Does your fellow Northeasterner Stephen King do something for you in terms of that, like The Shining and things like that?
He's such an inspiration. My first Stephen King book was Pet Cemetery,
Oh
and
yeah.
my uncle was staying with us, and he had a copy of it in his room, and I was like in there snooping around, and I saw it, and it was that like 80s cover with the cat on it,
Uh-huh.
and I just
With the
remember thinking
eyes.
like, yeah, the eyes, the shiny eyes, and I was like, what? There's grown-up books about cats? Like I didn't know that. So of course I took the book out of his room, and then like ran upstairs and started reading it. I very quickly understood it was not about a cat. I also
Yeah.
very quickly understood that it was not a book for kids. So I hid it inside my Victorian dollhouse. And like every day I would hide behind my dollhouse, like I'm playing with my dolls. And I was reading Pet Cemetery. And the book scared the crap out of me. And it also broke my heart because it's a really, really sad story.
It is, yeah.
So, because it's about grief, like at its
Hmm.
core, it's about grief, and I
Hmm.
love writing about grief. So I blame Stephen King and like my losses that I've had in life. But yes, he was such an inspiration because it was like the first time I realized I could be scared out of my wits and
Hmm.
crying at the same
Yeah.
time, and I was just like, oh, that's what I want to do to people. I want to scare them and have them sob.
That's awesome. So with your hotel series, it takes place in a time period you mentioned before, and I'm curious, what came first? Was it the Victorian aspect of it, or was it the psychological? Then you thought, oh, this would be a good place to put it in.
The Victorian aspect, it's so hard to say. It's so hard to say. The original idea for From Daylight to Madness came because I was doing past life regression,
Hmm.
and I experienced, whether it's a memory or just an experience, the very first scene in that book, and also the very last scene in that book, and and I it kind of got in my head like, what is this? Who's this woman? What was her actual life? Because like I only had
Hmm.
snippets of it. So that's where it started. And I knew a few things about her, and some of those were that she was sent away to like a hotel to
Hmm.
rest
Hmm.
when,
Which is pretty common
which is
for,
pretty common because
yeah.
she gave birth to a child. The child died shortly after birth, and
Yeah.
she wasn't grieving properly, or she was either
Hmm.
too sad or not sad enough. Whatever it was messy, it was awful, and so she was sent away. So yeah, I knew she was like in the Victorian era somewhere. So, but I also knew she had psychological problems. So those
Hmm.
things kind of happened at the same time. Like I knew who she was, and I knew where in time she was.
Hmm.
I just didn't know anything else.
It's common for like fantasy readers or fantasy authors and sci-fi authors to create series, but I get the impression that maybe you didn't intend for this to become a series. And how do you feel about that? Did you feel like you weren't sure about it, or did it come naturally when you decided
um,
to write Sleeping Dead?
yeah. So I honestly I wrote it as one really, really long book.
Oh, okay, it split it up.
Yeah. So I was, I think, like halfway through what's now When the Sleeping Dead Still Talk, and I realized I would have no idea how to market that book. Like I would not be able to talk
Wow, that's
about
pretty
it.
intuitive.
I was just like, what would the cover be? Because something
Mm.
kind of major happens at the end of From Daylight to Madness.
Mm.
And I was like, yes, that's the middle point of this story. Because the first book is about a character named Isabel. The second book is about a character named Frances. There's overlap. They are in each other's lives. But I just realized I didn't think I could do Frances the justice I wanted to do, because I felt like the entire book would be framed as Isabel's story, because she's the driving force for the first half of it. So that's when I split them in half. And then I took Sleeping Dead and I went back to the beginning and kind of gave it a rewrite. And I just like, I was so happy I did, because I think I got to explore Francis in a way that I wasn't really thinking of him. And then I had this like side character who was just supposed to be a bit player, and she became a huge part of When the Sleeping Dead Still Talk. And I feel like even though the story is done, the hotel, like Isabel and Francis's story, like it ends. There is that like character, her name's Agnes, that I just feel like she's like begging for a book or a novella of her own, like
Nice.
a third book in the hotel series, or just like a hotel adjacent.
The guest house,
The
maybe,
guest
or
house, yeah.
You have a style, you have a voice, and you've well established that. And a lot of people have mentioned, you know, and reading comments and reviews about your books, and then even just reading your blurbs, I can see it. I can feel your voice. I can see when you, even if it's a completely different subject matter than what you've tackled before. But it seems to me like your latest, Pretty Ugly, you're really doing something a little bit different than you've done before. Is that fair to say? Do you feel like that's something do you like to be challenged? Is that something that you were looking for? Or is it just a matter of, it was in my head and I got to get it out kind of idea?
You know, it was in my head and I wanted to get it out. And I also I needed like a mental break from Dagger Island and like that really, really, really deep Gothic, and just needed a break from it. And when I came up with the idea for Pretty Ugly, I legitimately thought I was going to be writing a rom-com at the end of the world, like a rom-com during a flesh-eating bacteria, like people's faces are rotting off. I thought I was going to write a comedy, and then it's not a comedy at all. It's very sad. There are a few funny parts, but I just kept like, to all my friends, I was like, oh yeah, this book's gonna be so much fun to write because it's hilarious. And then, you know, then COVID hit, and I was just like, oh, pandemics and like viruses that shut the world down, that's really not super funny.
Yeah, right.
Like, this really sucks. I don't know why I was thinking this was going to be a comedy. My voice is still definitely there in Pretty Ugly. My lyrical style, my literariness is still there, but it does have a different feel than the deep Gothic that I wrote before. I think some of the early reviews for Pretty Ugly that are coming in, and like some of like the blurbs I've gotten from people, they call it like a modern Gothic, and I love that because it still has some of the Gothic, I hate to say tropes, but Gothic tropes in it. But it's very contemporary. I mean, it's about an Instagram influencer and a politician.
Yeah.
So it's a far cry from, you know, my haunted island and my hotel that's filled
a whole
with
different era too.
Yeah.
Do you think about that when you're writing? Do you think about how it might alienate your audience if it's a little bit different, or do you not care? Do you just go with whatever you got to go with?
I do care. I do care.
I mean, that was a bad word. A bad choice of words.
No, I understand what you mean though, because you know, you get a reputation of like, oh, this is going to be like deep Gothic. It's going to be, you know, super, super, super dark psychological, and then there are aspects of that in Pretty Ugly, but not to the extent that I use in the other books. Like, I feel like the characters in Pretty Ugly do have trauma, and they do have things in their childhood that they didn't get over, but they have coping mechanisms, whether that's like being obsessed with Instagram. That's a coping mechanism. It is. She like develops like a whole fake online persona. And, you know, my politician might have an Adderall problem. and he drinks too much. So coping mechanisms, but not severe schizophrenia.
Yeah. Different ways.
Different ways, different ways.
So what did you like about writing Amelia?
She was just like, she ended up being so human. For a character that I originally thought of as she was going to be vain and vapid and all of these things, she didn't turn out to be any of those things. She turned out to actually have quite a low self-esteem, and she really didn't understand that it was like okay to love somebody, and she didn't understand that even like that it was okay for somebody to love her. She didn't have any of these like tools in her tool belt, her emotional tool belt. She like just didn't have it. So I loved writing her journey, because I spend a lot of time like kind of in flashbacks, childhood flashbacks for her. So you get a sense of her life, and it's not a spoiler because it happens on like the very first page. She does get this like strange disease that I'm writing about, and you can recover from it, but it always comes back. It flares up. So to me, like, it was interesting to write a character that from pretty much page one is like dying. She's like, she understands that very early on that like she is on a much shorter time span than anyone else. So it was interesting for me to write her trying to, come to terms with herself.
So writing Amelia and Sam, do you feel like there's in taking on this story, do you feel like it makes you a better writer? Do you feel like that all the time when you're writing something and then you write the next thing, you feel like a better writer?
I do. And I always feel like, I talk to a lot of writers myself, and when you ask them like, what is your favorite thing that you've done? Most of them are say like, well, the thing I'm working on right now.
Right. Yeah.
Like, I think, you learn something from every time you sit down there at the keyboard, whether it's a day, even you learn things even from the days that the words don't come. And you're just like, ugh. So yeah, I think it's good to just like keep challenging yourself. The book I'm writing now, which I'm not supposed to talk about, is certainly not, it's like unlike any of the books I've written already. It's a completely different genre. It's
nice.
So that's been a challenge, because I'm like, where do the ghosts go? I'm like, should I add in a ghost? And I'm like, nope, it's not that kind of book. And I'm like, maybe I'll add in a ghost and just cut it later.
It's often like, as the thrillers and creepy novels go, the idea of accelerating a timeline or giving it a drop deadline, or something to the effect where it's like a movie where the hero has 60 minutes to save the girl, or the girl has 60 minutes to save whatever, the city or the guy, creating that kind of sense of urgency. Is that kind of the new challenge for you in this book, do you think? Or is that something you like to do all the time?
I like to have kind of short windows of time. So like my book, Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent, it really takes place within like 1 week. And I mean, the Hotel series takes place over like, the first book takes place over like 2 months, like a summer, and it's difficult to say how long When the Sleeping Dead Still Talks goes over, because my main character loses time a lot. So he'll like close his eyes and all of a sudden it's winter and he's like, oh shoot, like what happened? So for Pretty Ugly, the whole thing had a different vibe to me. Like it really felt metaphorically and literally that I had characters on a train. There's like this movement to it.
You have Sam, you have Amelia. What are give us a side character in Pretty Ugly that you think we should look at, without spoiling anything, or who's a character you think is, impressed you when you were writing it?
Really, really liked the character Simon, which he's just a little boy that Sam meets because he does a PR stunt where he goes to an inner city school and reads some Hamlet to kids, and he's trying to be like oh, look how benevolent and nice I am, and
Right. And how smart I am.
how smart I am, and he befriends in a way this boy, and
Nice.
he just kind of popped out of nowhere. He is not who I thought was going to be there, but all of a sudden he was there.
It seems like you take your characters on these journeys and essentially you torment them and
Yes.
you create
Yeah.
this uncomfortableness that goes on for a reader. And then you take them to a threshold or a crescendo. And I'm kind of curious, do you draw a line there, or do you just go, ooh, how far can I take this? How can I torment them even more?
Yeah, it's that. I just think I haven't found a line yet that I'm like, did I cross that? I'm just,
Mm,
but I feel like if you write dark fiction, it's okay.
mm.
I mean, I hope it's okay. I've I've had some bad reviews of people who are like, this was just like 200 pages of sad, and I'm like,
Yep.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I feel like you should have known that. Like you picked up the book, if you read the blurb, it's like maybe it's not a feel-good novel. If the blurb says like Adam, a young alcoholic, recently lost his young son and wife in a horrific car crash, it's like, well, you're gonna get a book about that, and
Yeah,
not.
it's not a rom-com.
Yeah, it's not a rom-com. And then I've had people like just like flat out message me like, I thought he was gonna fall in love with the ghost. I'm like, why would you think that? Like,
Uh,
I didn't say that, and
mm.
I never even like insinuated it. And they were like, so yeah, I just like to torment my characters, I guess. That's
I'm curious, have you taken them in a direction that you didn't think worked and it ended up working, and the opposite? Did you take them in a direction that didn't work and you had to rework it?
I think in the book I'm writing now, I took a certain character and I put them in a weird direction, and then I had to go back and like retrofit that so it was more enjoyable for me to write
Mm, mm.
and for people to read. Because like I think as a writer, if you're writing it and going like, nobody's like, I don't even enjoy this person anymore, like you have to make sure all characters don't need to be enjoyable, they don't need to be likable, but there has to be some part of you that loves them,
Hmm.
I think. So
Or loves to torture them.
loves to torture them. Yeah, I mean, I took Agnes from the Hotel series in a very really really twisted direction, but I think it was for the best.
Nice.
I made her do some legitimately horrifying things that you're like, I broke some of the rules where it says like, in a book, never kill a cat or blah blah blah, or
Yeah.
like there's like all these rules, and I made her break I think 2 of the cardinal ones.
Nice.
But people ended up liking her. They're like, I know I'm not supposed to like her, but man, see, and that's a great character. Like that's when you know you
Yeah.
have a great character, when they're not likable, but people
Yeah.
love them
Mhm.
and feel for
Totally.
them when they
Yeah. Yeah. Even though you go, you're crazy
are crazy.
for liking that person.
I was like, Agnes, no.
So, what does every Jennifer Ann Gordon story have to have?
It has to have an internal emotional struggle with my main characters. I
Nice.
think it has to be about the ugly truths of ourselves, the parts of us that are so broken you don't think that it's possible to get healed. It has to have that. It has to have beauty inside tragedy. I love grief writing, so there's always like an element of that. And grief writing doesn't necessarily have to be death, but
Hmm.
the process of grieving is just so fascinating to me, and so
That's awesome.
that's that.